Everyone's seen the Webley revolver, but almost no one has actually understood it. For decades it sat in the shadow of the Luger, dismissed, mocked, called clunky, outdated, and embarrassing by the very soldiers who carried it. Officers complained about it, historians underplayed it, and gun enthusiasts for the better part of a century treated it like the awkward footnote of two world wars, just a big, ugly, top-breaking revolver from an empire that didn't know when to let go of the past. But here's the thing, the story you've been told about the Webley is wrong, not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. And the comparison that gets made most often, the one where the Webley gets stacked up against the German Luger and comes out looking like a relic next to a masterpiece, that comparison has the conclusion completely backwards. The Webley revolver was not the inferior weapon. In the actual conditions of actual war, in the mud, in the trenches, in the desperate hand-to-hand chaos of the Western Front and beyond, the Webley was deadlier, more reliable, and more survivable than the Luger in almost every meaningful way. And by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why, not just through specs on a page, through real history, through the testimony of the men who fired both, through the physics of what happens when a weapon gets wet, dirty, and is shoved against a man's chest in the dark. If that sounds like something worth understanding, stay with us. Subscribe so you don't miss the next time we pull a story like this out from under the weight of bad history, because there are a lot more where this came from. Let's start at the beginning, not with the guns themselves but with the world they were built for. By the 1880s, the British Empire was the largest political entity in human history. It spanned 6 continents. It governed territories from the frozen reaches of Canada to the sweltering plains of India, from the deserts of Egypt to the jungles of West Africa. And holding all of that together required, among other things, soldiers, enormous numbers of soldiers spread thin across an enormous number of environments. Those soldiers needed sidearms, not ceremonial sidearms, not parade ground props, real weapons that worked in dust storms and monsoons, real weapons that could be drawn quickly when a cavalry charge went wrong. Real weapons that could function when they hadn't been cleaned in a week because the man carrying them had been fighting dysentery or marching through mountain passes that would have killed most men before they ever got to fire anything. The British Army had tried various revolvers through the 1870s and into the early 1880s. Some were decent, some were less than that, but none of them fully satisfied the combination of requirements that a global empire fighting in a dozen different climate zones at once actually needed. Enter Philip Webley, and more specifically, enter his firm Webley & Scott. Philip Webley had been making firearms since the 1830s. His company, based in Birmingham, had grown into one of the most respected arms manufacturers in Britain. And in 1887, after years of testing, refinement, and competition, the British Army officially adopted the Webley Mark I as its standard service revolver. It wasn't an accident that they chose it. It wasn't political favoritism. It was because Webley & Scott had solved a problem that everyone else was still arguing about. How do you make a revolver that is simultaneously powerful enough to stop a determined attacker, simple enough to be operated by an exhausted and frightened soldier with shaking hands, and fast enough to reload under fire? The answer was the top break action. This is the feature that everyone mocks when they pick up an old Webley photograph and sneer at it. The gun breaks open at the top. The barrel tips forward, and when it does, a spring-loaded extractor plate ejects all 6 spent cartridges simultaneously, all 6 at once, automatically, the moment you break the action open. Compare that to a Colt or a Smith & Wesson swing-out cylinder revolver where you open the cylinder sideways and then have to manually push a rod to eject cases, one group at a time. Or to a fixed-frame revolver where you eject cases one by one through a loading gate. With the Webley, you break it open, you tip it, 6 cases fall out, you load 6 fresh rounds, you snap it shut, and you're back in action. The whole process in trained hands took less than 10 seconds. Less than 10 seconds to go from an empty gun to a fully loaded one. That mattered. In a war where the difference between living and dying was often measured in single heartbeats, 10 seconds versus 30 seconds was not a minor technical detail. It was the difference between getting a second chance and not getting one. The cartridge the Webley fired was the .455 Webley. And this is where the story starts to get genuinely interesting because the .455 Webley is not a round that gets talked about much in modern gun culture. It's old, it's obsolete. You can't walk into a sporting goods store and buy it off the shelf. But in the context of stopping a human being at close range, it was a monster. The .455 Webley fired a blunt, heavy bullet. The standard load pushed a 265-grain projectile at roughly 650 feet per second. That sounds slow compared to modern handgun cartridges, and in terms of raw velocity it is slow. But velocity isn't the only thing that determines how effectively a bullet stops a person. The .455 Webley bullet was wide, it was soft, and it transferred an enormous amount of energy directly into the target rather than passing through. In the language of terminal ballistics, it had outstanding stopping power, not because it was fast but because it was big, slow, and it hit like a hammer. British soldiers fighting in colonial wars and then in the First World War described the effect of the .455 Webley as decisive. That's a polite word. What it means is that when you shot someone with a .455 Webley, they stopped. They didn't usually keep coming. They didn't usually require a second shot. The kinetic transfer was substantial enough to cause immediate, significant trauma. Now let's talk about the Luger. The Luger Pistol 8, to give it its full designation, is one of the most beautiful handguns ever made. That is not a controversial statement. It is widely accepted as a fact. The lines of the Luger are extraordinary. The toggle lock action, the distinctive angled grip, the way it sits in the hand, all of it looks like something a designer dreamed up rather than something an engineer built for killing people. It has an elegance that most military firearms completely lack. And the German military was deeply proud of it. When the Pistol 8 was officially adopted in 1908, it represented German engineering at its most precise and refined. The tolerances were tight. The mechanism was clever. The 9 Parabellum cartridge it fired was a genuinely excellent round. Fast, flat shooting with good penetration and enough energy to cause serious tissue damage at close ranges. On a firing range, the Luger outperformed almost everything. It was accurate, it was controllable, experienced shooters loved it, officers who got to fire it under ideal conditions came away impressed. The problem, the fundamental, catastrophic, war-losing problem with the Luger was that it was not designed for war. Not real war. Not the kind of war that actually happened between 1914 and 1918. The Luger was designed for a kind of conflict that existed mostly in the imaginations of pre-war military planners. Clean, fast-moving, decisive battles where officers fired their sidearms occasionally in well-defined situations and then had the leisure to clean and maintain their weapons afterward. What actually happened in the First World War was something entirely different. What actually happened was the Western Front. Let's talk about what the Western Front actually was, because a lot of people know the name without really understanding the environment. The Western Front was a line of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Hundreds of miles of dug earth, reinforced with timber and sandbags, connected by communication trenches and supply lines and underground bunkers. It was the most sustained, intensive, destructive piece of warfare in human history up to that point. And the defining characteristic of that environment, the thing that shaped every decision about tactics and weapons and survival, was mud. Belgian and northern French mud specifically. This is not ordinary mud. The soil in that region, churned up by millions of shells and soaked by the relentless rain of a North Atlantic climate and mixed with the organic matter of things that had once been alive and were no longer, created a substance that was essentially liquid ground. Men sank into it. Horses drowned in it. Artillery pieces disappeared into it. The mud of the Somme and of Passchendaele was not an inconvenience. It was a battlefield condition as dangerous as enemy fire. And weapons went into that mud. They got coated in it, they got packed with it. Fine particles found their way into every gap, every crevice, every mechanical tolerance in a firearm. For the Luger, this was a death sentence. The Luger's toggle lock mechanism is a masterpiece of engineering in clean conditions. When it fires, the barrel and receiver travel rearward together, then a jointed toggle link breaks upward at its center, cycling the action and chambering a fresh round. It's elegant, it's efficient, and it requires extremely tight tolerances between moving parts to function correctly. Those tight tolerances, the very thing that made the Luger accurate and smooth, were also the reason it choked the moment it encountered any significant contamination. Dirt in the toggle mechanism could prevent the action from cycling. Mud packed into the receiver caused stoppages that couldn't be cleared quickly. Even small amounts of debris in the wrong place could render the weapon completely non-functional. German soldiers in the trenches knew this. They developed workarounds. Some covered their Lugers with cloth or leather when not in use. Some carried them in specially designed holsters that offered more protection. Some simply accepted that if conditions got bad enough, their sidearm was going to fail them. And conditions always got bad enough. There are accounts from German officers during the major offensives of 1914 to 1918 describing the moment when their Luger jammed in the middle of a firefight. Some of them survived that moment. Many did not. The weapon that was supposed to be a last resort became a liability in the exact circumstances where a last resort was needed. Now contrast that with the Webley. The Webley revolver has no toggle mechanism, it has no short recoil operation, it has no complex series of interlocked metal parts that have to move in precise sequence for the weapon to function. It is a revolver. A cylinder holds the cartridges, you pull the trigger, the cylinder rotates, the hammer falls, the cartridge fires. That is the entire mechanical sequence. There is almost no way to make a Webley fail through contamination alone. Mud in the cylinder gap, the gun still fires. Dirt packed into the frame, the gun still fires. Grit in the trigger mechanism, the gun still fires. You could submerge a Webley in a trench full of French mud, pull it out dripping, and fire it. Not because it was designed to be thrown around carelessly, but because the fundamental mechanical simplicity of a revolver has an inherent resistance to failure that no semi-automatic pistol of that era could match. British soldiers understood this intuitively. Many of them had never read a word of ballistics theory or mechanical engineering, but they lived in those trenches. They experienced the mud every single day, and they trusted the Webley with their lives in a way that German soldiers could not always trust the Luger, because the Webley earned that trust through consistent performance in the worst possible conditions. There is a specific type of combat that defined the First World War experience in a way that almost nothing else did: trench raids. A trench raid was a small unit operation, usually carried out at night, in which a group of men would cross no man's land under cover of darkness, breach the enemy's wire, drop into his trenches, and fight at close quarters. The objectives varied. Sometimes the goal was to capture prisoners for interrogation. Sometimes it was to destroy specific positions or equipment. Sometimes it was simply to inflict casualties and demoralize. Whatever the objective, the conditions were identical: close, dark, chaotic, often involving hand-to-hand fighting in a space barely wide enough for two men to pass each other. In a trench raid, distances measured in dozens of meters became irrelevant. What mattered was what happened when you were face to face with another human being in the dark. Soldiers going on trench raids did not rely primarily on rifles. Rifles were too long and too awkward in the confined space of an enemy trench. They relied on pistols, on clubs, on trench knives, on grenades, on whatever they could swing or fire at the closest possible range. In that environment, the .455 Webley was a devastating weapon, not because of its accuracy at distance. At trench raid distances, accuracy was largely irrelevant. You were not taking aimed shots in the dark at a man 3 feet away from you. You were pressing a gun against him or firing from the hip at a shape you could barely see. What mattered was the terminal effect of the cartridge, and the .455 Webley's terminal effect was, as already discussed, exceptional. But the Webley also had another advantage in trench raids that rarely gets mentioned: it was double action. A double-action revolver can be fired simply by pulling the trigger. The trigger pull both cocks the hammer and releases it. There is no requirement to manually cock the hammer before each shot. You pull, it fires. You pull again, it fires again, 6 times without any additional action required. In a trench raid, your hands might be cut. They might be shaking with adrenaline. You might be grappling with someone while trying to fire. In those conditions, the ability to just pull the trigger and fire is not a minor convenience. It is a survival advantage of the highest order. The Luger was also capable of double-action fire in theory. In practice, German military Lugers were issued in a configuration that many soldiers effectively treated as single-action, and the trigger-pull characteristics of the Luger in combat conditions were not regarded as ideal for the kind of desperate, contact-range shooting that trench raids required. And then there's the matter of what happens after your gun runs dry. A Webley with 6 empty chambers takes around 10 seconds to reload, as already described. A Luger with an empty 8-round magazine takes slightly longer because the magazine has to be removed and a fresh one seated and the slide released. On a range, that's easy. In the dark, with shaking hands, possibly with an opponent still fighting back, it becomes genuinely difficult. But here's the deeper issue with the Luger and ammunition. The Luger's magazine had to be maintained carefully. The spring tension had to be correct. A magazine with a damaged or weakened spring caused feeding failures. A magazine with a bent lip caused stoppages. If you dropped a Luger magazine into a muddy trench bottom and picked it up and jammed it back into the gun, there was a real chance your next trigger pull gave you nothing. A Webley's ammunition was loaded directly into the cylinder chambers. There was no magazine to worry about. No spring to maintain, no lips to bend. You put a cartridge in a chamber, it stayed there until it was fired. That mechanical simplicity extended all the way down to the ammunition interface, and it meant one less thing that could go wrong in the worst possible moment. Now let's address the argument that gets made most consistently in defense of the Luger's superiority, and that's the argument about magazine capacity and rate of fire. The Luger held 8 rounds in its standard magazine. The Webley held 6 in its cylinder. That's 2 additional rounds in favor of the Luger per reload. And because the Luger was semi-automatic, it could theoretically fire all 8 rounds faster than the Webley could fire its 6. On paper, this seems significant. In practice, in the specific contexts where these weapons were most often used, it was almost meaningless. Start with the capacity argument. 6 rounds of .455 Webley versus 8 rounds of 9 Parabellum. If we accept the real-world stopping power data, the Webley's .455 round was substantially more likely to put an attacker down with a single hit than the 9 round of the period. Not every time, not guaranteed, nothing in combat is guaranteed. But the historical record and the ballistic physics both strongly suggest that the .455 Webley required fewer rounds per incapacitation than the 9. If your 6 rounds are each more effective than your opponent's 9, the raw capacity comparison becomes misleading. You're not comparing equal inputs and counting outputs. You're comparing different inputs with different outputs, and the math doesn't automatically favor the larger number. Beyond that, consider the actual nature of sidearm use in the First World War. Pistols, whether Webley or Luger, were not primary combat weapons. They were sidearms. They were last resort weapons. They were drawn when the rifle was gone, when the situation had collapsed to its most. But on the whole, the capacity advantage of the Luger was far less decisive in practice than it appears on a specification sheet. There's another dimension to this comparison that almost never gets discussed, and it involves something very specific to the First World War and the particular nature of the fighting in 1917 and 1918. By the later stages of the war, the British Army had developed what became known as the stormtrooper tactics, independently of the Germans who were developing similar concepts on their side. Small units, moving fast, bypassing strongpoints, disrupting enemy command and control, operating with a high degree of initiative at the unit level. For these operations, the ideal sidearm was exactly what the Webley was: reliable, powerful, fast to reload with practice, capable of functioning in any environmental condition. A weapon a soldier could trust completely without having to think about it, which meant his mental bandwidth was entirely available for thinking about the fight. The Luger, by contrast, required thought. Not a lot, not constantly, but it required awareness of its limitations. A soldier with a Luger had to think about keeping it clean, had to think about his magazine situation, had to think about whether his action was going to cycle cleanly in the current conditions. That cognitive overhead was not enormous, but in a high-stress combat environment, any cognitive overhead is too much. The Webley asked nothing of the man carrying it except that he load it and pull the trigger. It handled everything else. Let's talk about the men who actually carried these weapons, because one of the things that gets lost in the technical comparison is the human element. British officers in the First World War came from a specific cultural and professional background. Many of them had experience with firearms from hunting and sport shooting. Many had served in colonial campaigns before the war. They knew weapons. They had opinions about weapons. And they trusted the Webley not because they'd been told to trust it, but because many of them had used it under actual field conditions before 1914 and knew exactly what it could do. T.E. Lawrence, the legendary British officer who organized and led the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, carried a Webley. He carried it across deserts and through mountain campaigns and in close-quarters engagements with Ottoman forces. He trusted it. He never wrote at length about switching to anything else because there was nothing that would have served him better in the conditions he operated in. Wilfred Owen, the poet and infantry officer whose work defined the literary response to the First World War, carried a Webley when he returned to the front in 1918. He was killed in action just days before the armistice, and his revolver was with him, not a Luger captured from the enemy, not a different sidearm. The weapon his army issued him, the weapon he'd been trained with and trusted. These were not uninformed men, they were experienced, they were intelligent. They had access to the full range of military equipment and in some cases the means to obtain other weapons privately. They carried Webleys because Webleys worked. On the German side, the record on the Luger is more complicated. German officers valued the Luger deeply, and there are plenty of accounts of its effective use in combat. but there are also substantial accounts of its failures. German military assessments from the middle and later stages of the war acknowledged the reliability problems. There were discussions about alternative sidearms, which eventually led to the adoption of the Mauser C96 and later the Walther P38 as the German military sought more reliable semi-automatic options. The fact that Germany was already looking for alternatives to the Luger during the war itself is a fairly clear statement about what experienced soldiers had concluded about its performance in field conditions. There's also a manufacturing dimension to this story that rarely comes up in the standard comparison. The Webley was relatively straightforward to produce. It required skilled labor and good materials, but it was not a weapon that demanded extraordinary manufacturing precision. The tolerances, by design, were not so tight that minor variations in production caused functional problems. This meant that even as wartime manufacturing pressure increased and the quality of available labor and materials fluctuated, Webley revolvers continued to function reliably. The Luger was the exact opposite. It required extremely high manufacturing precision. The tight tolerances that made it perform well in clean conditions also meant that any deviation in the production process could result in a weapon that didn't function correctly. As the war went on and Germany's industrial capacity came under increasing strain, the quality of Luger production declined. Late-war Lugers show measurably more variation in fitting and finishing than pre-war examples, and that variation translated directly into reliability problems that early production Lugers didn't exhibit to the same degree. In other words, even if you accepted the argument that a perfect Luger was superior to a Webley in some meaningful combat sense, late-war German soldiers were not carrying perfect Lugers. They were carrying weapons that had been made under increasing industrial stress by workers who were less skilled than those who had produced earlier examples. And those weapons were less reliable than the standard that the Luger's defenders use when making their comparisons. The Webley, by contrast, maintained consistent quality throughout the war because its design didn't require the same level of precision to function properly. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the redesign. If the Webley was so effective, why did the British Army decide to move away from it after the First World War? Why, in 1932, did they officially adopt the Enfield No. 2 MKI revolver in .38 Special as the standard service revolver, effectively replacing the .455 Webley? This is the question that Webley skeptics always come back to, and it's a fair one. If the weapon was so good, why did it get replaced? The answer is complicated and involves a mixture of military politics, budgetary considerations, and a fundamental change in thinking about what a service sidearm was actually for. First, the caliber question. By the late 1920s, the British Army had concluded that the .455 Webley was unnecessarily powerful for a service pistol. This wasn't entirely wrong as a technical assessment. The .455 Webley was a heavy cartridge. It produced significant recoil. Training soldiers to shoot it accurately required more range time than a lighter cartridge would. And the military brass, in the relatively peaceful interwar period, had the luxury of thinking about training costs and ammunition logistics in a way that wasn't available to anyone between 1914 and 1918. There was also a broader trend in Western military thinking toward lighter service pistols. The United States had adopted the 1911 Colt in .45 ACP. European armies were moving toward 9 semi-automatics. The general direction of military pistol development was toward lighter, faster-firing weapons, and the Webley sat firmly on the wrong side of that direction. But here's what's critical to understand about that transition. The decision to move away from the Webley was not made on the basis of wartime performance. It was made in peacetime, by people who had no immediate experience of the conditions that had defined the Webley's wartime utility. It was made by committees examining logistics and training costs and alignment with broader military trends, not by soldiers evaluating what kept them alive in a trench. And the weapon that replaced it, the Enfield No. 2 in .38 Special, was not regarded as more effective in stopping power terms. It was explicitly regarded as less powerful. That was a deliberate trade-off. The British Army consciously chose to reduce terminal effectiveness in exchange for easier training and lighter weight. Whether that was the right call for the wars that came after is a separate argument. But it makes clear that the replacement of the Webley was a peacetime administrative decision, not a wartime verdict on effectiveness. The Luger, by contrast, was also replaced. Germany officially moved to the Walther P38 as its standard service pistol before the Second World War. The P-38 was a significant improvement over the Luger in terms of reliability and ease of manufacture. Germany's own military effectively acknowledged through that replacement that the Luger's operational limitations made a better-designed semi-automatic a priority. So both guns were replaced, but the reasons were different. The Webley was replaced for reasons of logistics, weight, and a peacetime reassessment of how much stopping power a sidearm actually needed. The Luger was replaced in large part because its reliability in field conditions was not what a modern military weapon required. That distinction matters enormously when you're trying to understand which weapon was actually more effective in the conditions both guns were designed and issued to operate in. Let's now look at some of the specific engagement records from the First World War that speak directly to the question of which weapon saved more lives. One of the best documented uses of the Webley in the First World War comes from the experiences of Royal Flying Corps and later Royal Air Force pilots. Early in the war, pilots carried revolvers primarily as a weapon of last resort if forced down in enemy territory. But as the war developed and aerial combat evolved, the revolver took on additional significance. Some pilots carried their Webleys during air combat, using them in close-range encounters with enemy aircraft, a tactic that sounds almost absurd from a modern perspective, but that was entirely real. More significantly, pilots who survived being shot down over enemy lines and subsequently escaped or were captured reported relying on their Webleys in ground engagements. The revolver's reliability was particularly valued in these situations because a downed pilot had no support, no logistics chain, and no means of cleaning or maintaining a more complex weapon. If the gun he carried worked under those conditions, it worked. If it didn't, he was defenseless. The Webley worked. There are also multiple documented accounts from the Gallipoli campaign, where British, Australian, and New Zealand forces fought Ottoman forces in conditions nearly as demanding as the Western Front. The heat, the dust, and the intense close quarters fighting at places like Lone Pine and Chinook created circumstances where sidearms were used heavily and where reliability was tested at every turn. After-action reports from that campaign consistently praised the Webley for continuing to function in conditions that had defeated or degraded other weapons. In contrast, captured German Lugers that found their way into Allied hands were regarded with a mixture of admiration and caution. They were beautiful weapons. Experienced soldiers knew how accurate and smooth they could be, but they also knew quickly that the Luger required a level of care and maintenance that combat conditions rarely permitted. Captured Lugers became prized souvenirs more often than they became trusted combat weapons, because the men who captured them and had the experience to evaluate them understood the reliability trade-off they were making. Let's zoom out for a moment and consider what this comparison tells us about a broader principle of weapon design. Because the Webley versus Luger story is not really just about two guns, it's about a fundamental design philosophy. The Luger represents what might be called the engineering elegance approach to weapon design. Start with the best possible mechanism. Achieve the tightest possible tolerances. Build a weapon that performs at the highest level under ideal conditions and trust that soldiers and armies will maintain the conditions necessary for it to perform. The Webley represents what might be called the combat pragmatism approach. Start with the worst-case scenario. Ask what conditions a soldier might realistically encounter in actual warfare. Design a weapon that continues to function through all of those conditions, even if it sacrifices some performance under ideal circumstances to achieve that goal. In the history of military small arms, the combat pragmatism approach wins, almost every time. The AK-47 over the early M16 in Vietnam. The Browning high power over the Luger in the Second World War. The Glock over various more elegant semi-automatics in modern law enforcement. The pattern repeats. The weapon that functions reliably under terrible conditions, even if it's less refined under ideal ones, is the weapon that soldiers trust and that saves lives when it matters. The Webley was not a sophisticated weapon. It was not elegant. It was not the product of the kind of innovative mechanical engineering that produced the Luger's toggle lock action. But it was reliable, consistently, stubbornly, almost perversely reliable in conditions that should have defeated it. And that reliability in the context of a world war fought in mud and rain and darkness was worth more than all of the Luger's precision and elegance combined. There's one more aspect of this story that deserves attention, and it's the most human part of all. We've talked about specifications. We've talked about reliability data and terminal ballistics and mechanical tolerances. But behind all of that is the question of what it actually felt like to carry one of these weapons into combat. Not to read about them, not to analyze them, to carry them knowing that your life might depend on them in the next few minutes. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from carrying a weapon you know will work, not a weapon you hope will work, not a weapon that performs well when conditions are favorable. A weapon you know will work. A weapon whose operation is so simple and so robust that you never have to wonder whether it's going to let you down when you reach for it in the dark. That confidence has military value that cannot be easily quantified, but that anyone who has ever served in a combat environment understands intuitively. A soldier who trusts his weapon completely is a better soldier than one who carries uncertainty alongside his equipment. The cognitive overhead of doubting your sidearm is a burden that compounds every other burden of combat, and it is a burden that the Webley did not impose on the men who carried it. British officers in the First World War, many of them well-educated men who could have articulated a technical argument about their sidearm if they'd chosen to, trusted the Webley. Not blindly, not out of habit or national pride. They trusted it because it had earned that trust over and over in conditions that demanded everything a weapon had. The Luger, for all its beauty and engineering achievement, was a weapon that asked to be trusted and then sometimes failed to honor that trust. That is not a weapon that earns confidence. That is a weapon that induces doubt. And in combat, doubt costs lives. Now we come to the part of the story that takes us beyond the Western Front and into the Second World War, because both weapons survived into that conflict and their performance records there add another layer of complexity to the comparison. The Webley did not remain the standard British service revolver in the Second World War. The Enfield No. 2 had officially replaced it in the British Army by 1932, as already discussed, but Webleys remained in service in enormous numbers. They were issued to Home Guard units, to colonial forces, to officers in secondary theaters, and to a wide range of Commonwealth troops. The British Empire went to war in 1939 with millions of Webleys still in service across its various armed forces. In North Africa, in the deserts where sand got into everything and temperature extremes were as brutal as the fighting, the Webley continued to perform. Desert conditions are among the harshest possible for a semi-automatic pistol. Fine sand particles invade semi-automatic mechanisms in ways that are extraordinarily difficult to prevent and clear. A revolver simply rotates its cylinder and fires. The sand that would stop a semi-automatic dead goes nowhere mechanically significant in a revolver's operation. British officers fighting in the Western Desert Campaign carried Webleys alongside their newer Enfield revolvers, and the Webley's reputation for desert reliability was consistent with everything it had demonstrated in the First World War. Different environment, different enemy, same result. The Luger was still in German service in the Second World War, though increasingly supplemented and in some theaters effectively replaced by the Walther P-38. On the Eastern Front, where the conditions were arguably even more extreme than the Western Front of the First World War, combining bitter cold, ice, mud, dust, and the full spectrum of environmental assault, the Luger's reliability problems were again documented. German soldiers on the Eastern Front faced conditions where lubricating oil froze, where metal contracted in the cold and changed the mechanical relationships between parts, and where the maintenance infrastructure to deal with these problems was consistently inadequate. The Walther P-38 performed somewhat better than the Luger under these conditions. It had been designed with greater tolerance for field conditions than the Luger, but neither matched the simple, stubborn reliability of a well-made revolver in extreme environments. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but widely repeated in accounts of the Eastern Front, of German soldiers carrying captured Soviet Nagant revolvers or Tokarev semi-automatics preferentially over their Lugers in the worst of the winter fighting. Not because those weapons were better designed or more pleasant to use, but because they functioned. Soldiers in the field have always been pragmatists. They carry what works, and when the Luger stopped working, they carried something else. British soldiers with Webleys didn't have that problem to solve. Let's talk about the post-war legacy of both weapons, because it tells us something interesting about how history ultimately judged them versus how popular culture has judged them. In popular culture, the Luger won the comparison completely. It became one of the most iconic firearms in the world. It appeared in hundreds of war films, in spy thrillers, in adventure stories. It became shorthand for German military power. Collectors sought it out. Replica manufacturers reproduced it. The Luger is immediately recognizable to virtually everyone who has any awareness of 20th-century military history, and it almost universally comes with an aura of menace and technological sophistication. The Webley became something else. It became the gun that awkward British officers fumbled with in films about the Second World War. It became a prop representing an empire that was already out of date. It appeared in period dramas as a symbol of old-fashioned stubbornness, a relic being carried past its time by men who hadn't gotten the memo that the modern age had arrived. None of that popular culture narrative has any meaningful relationship with the actual wartime performance record of either weapon. The Luger's cinematic appeal comes from its appearance and its mechanical interest, not from any documented battlefield advantage over the weapons it competed against. The Webley's cinematic frumpiness comes from its blunt, no-nonsense appearance and its association with an empire that popular culture had decided to portray as out of touch, not from any actual performance failure. Among serious historians of military firearms, the assessment is different. Among people who have studied the actual records, the after-action reports, the testimony of the men who carried these weapons and survived to describe their experiences, the Webley's reliability and effectiveness in the specific conditions of the First World War is well documented and consistently acknowledged. The embarrassment attached to the Webley is a cultural artifact. It's a story we've told ourselves because the gun looks old and clunky and because the empire it served had its own historical complications. It's not a verdict that emerged from an honest assessment of what the weapon actually did when it mattered. The Luger's prestige is also largely a cultural artifact. It looks like the future. It looks like precision and sophistication and modernity. And in the late Victorian and Edwardian cultural context that produced both weapons, looking like the future was enormously powerful. The Luger was the weapon of an empire that prided itself on scientific and industrial achievement. The Webley was the weapon of an empire that prided itself on practical results. And practical results in those years were somehow less impressive to the people writing the history than engineering elegance. Military history is littered with weapons that were regarded as inferior by their contemporaries and later recognized as having been the more practical and effective choice. The flintlock musket over the early rifle, the Lee Enfield over the Schmidt-Rubin, the M1 Garand over the various semi-automatic rifles that never quite made it to mass production in time to matter. In every case, the weapon that worked reliably under field conditions that could be produced in sufficient numbers, maintained by ordinary soldiers and trusted in the worst possible circumstances, turned out to be the more decisive weapon regardless of whether it won the elegance comparison. The Webley belongs in that tradition, not as a technically superior weapon in some abstract engineering sense, but as a weapon that did what weapons are supposed to do in the conditions that weapons actually encounter. It fired when you needed it to fire. It reloaded quickly enough to matter. It hit hard enough to stop the man you were shooting at. And it did all of that in the mud and blood and darkness of the worst war the world had ever seen, without asking anything from the soldier except that he carry it and pull the trigger. That is what a combat weapon is for, not for looking good in photographs, not for impressing range officers under ideal conditions, not for being admired as a mechanical achievement by people who will never have to trust it with their lives. The Webley was made to be trusted with lives, and in that, it succeeded far more completely than the Luger, which was made to be admired. There's a final point to make, and it brings us back to where we started, to the word embarrassing in the title of this discussion. The Webley was called embarrassing by people who evaluated weapons by how they looked, and by how they fit into the prevailing narrative of modernity and progress. It was dismissed by people who thought that a heavy, top-breaking revolver from the Victorian era had no place in a 20th-century military. It was overlooked by historians who found the Luger's story more interesting, because the Luger's story had more drama and more elegance and more cinematic appeal. But embarrassment is a social emotion. It has to do with what other people think. It has nothing to do with what works. The Webley was not embarrassed by the Luger. It outperformed.